anyway, I'll give it up for our speaker, David Chelsea.
Okay. So what I'm going to be presenting is a PowerPoint presentation from a that I presented about 10 years ago, but it's, you know, the information in it is still good. Perspective doesn't change that much.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I just realized
in order to do this, I'm going to have to figure out how to share my screen. All right. Okay. So there's my screen. I am sharing screen, and everybody can still hear me, I hope.
Yes.
Yes,
Nice.
yes.
Yep.
Okay.
And David, will we be getting a copy of your PowerPoint?
You'll be seeing it. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know about getting a copy. If anybody wants one, it's kind of a big file, so
Is it? Okay.
maybe I'll provide the link that from my Google Drive if people want to look at it. Anyway, this is perspective as we understand it. Just an illustration demonstrating the basic principles, which I did not always understand perfectly. This is a drawing I did at about the age of 4. I'm copying the credits from the Jack Benny show, and my understanding did not extend this beyond a kind of a frieze-like flat image. Fast forward to when I was about 16, and this is an early cartooning effort, and I've got an idea somehow that lines recede, but I can't seem to manage to get them all to go to a single vanishing point. So, you know, those are meant to be, you know, bathroom tiles on that wall behind him, and they really don't quite make it. So a few years later, I actually went to art school and lasted a full semester at School of Visual Arts. And that semester included a drawing class, which included one session devoted to perspective. So armed with that, I was able to realize that all the vanishing points, or all the lines go to a single vanishing point, and I was able to do this shallow box for my characters. This is an early illustration job. Basically, I quit art school in order to go out and work as an illustrator because I had no respect for what they were teaching me. Possibly I should have stayed. Possibly I should have listened more, taken more perspective courses. But, you know, this is the arrogance of youth. So here's another illustration. This is from 1980. And I kind of have got the whole receding lines going to a single vanishing point. It might even be that nursing button. And it applies to the floor tiles, but not to the bottom edge of that mattress. And you know, this is a common, you know, beginner's mistake, just, you know, not realizing that all the lines go the same direction. Here again, I'm papering over my basic lack of understanding with lots and lots of cartoony detail and hoping that people don't mind. Here's another early illustration job. I know the bit about lines going to the vanishing point, but I've stuck the vanishing point way off to the side outside the picture, which works for 2-point perspective, but not for 1-point perspective. And the other notable mistake I've made here is that wagon wheel. It should be a tilted ellipse. I've got it as a straight up and down ellipse. And here I'm just using overlap. Here I'm completely ducking perspective because I really don't understand it. It's way too complicated. And here I've got everything more or less in the right place, and I'm ducking any perspective difficulty by making the floor featureless, because it was just beyond me figuring how the floorboards ought to go. Similarly here, I've got a road. It's kind of featureless. There are no real perspective cues. Everything is kind of in the right place, but the man is way out of scale with especially the car in front of him. He couldn't really fit into it. And I kind of muddled through as a freelance illustrator for a few years, working at this level, until I got a job that was more of a challenge. This was for an ESL textbook, and it was meant to be kind of a film noir murder scene with 2 dead bodies on the floor. And I needed to draw a tile pattern on the floor and make it all realistic. And, here's an early sketch. The figures are all basically realistic, but I'm very much guessing at the space they're inhabiting. And I even did a plan view, sort of trying to help me here, but I was kind of lost. Now, as it happens, my next door neighbor in my apartment building was a graphic designer. And in the middle of this job, I just knocked on her door and asked, "Do you have any books on perspective?" And this is what she gave me, which is Architectural Graphics by Frank Ching, which was actually an excellent introduction. It's a good book generally on architectural graphics, but it covers perspective. And specifically what I needed to do was 2-point perspective for this job. So here's how he lines it up, or how he outlines it. And this is pretty clear. This lays it out really well, and importantly gives you a sense of how all the vanishing points are on the same horizon. So working it out, I was able to do this sketch, which I think is pretty good. And here's the finished piece.
Oh, it's not bad.
Now, a little while after that, I saw an ad in the paper for a workshop on linear perspective and the creation of pictorial space, taught by Gary Fagan, who has since gone on to found Gage Academy in Seattle. Mostly, he's a fine artist, and he has written a great book on facial expressions, and most of what he teaches is anatomy, but this was kind of a sideline of his. And after I took his workshop, I was able to do more ambitious things like this 2-point vertical perspective view. Still had a little trouble with the man in the chair. He's all off, but the rest of the details are solid. Here's another view. I was a great one for doing people sitting on buildings. Now, as much fun as it is to set up perspective from scratch, sometimes under deadlines, you want a little bit of a shortcut. So here are some perspective grids, which are basically designed for architectural artists, but they worked fine for illustration. And I was able to do a lot of work, just kind of working over these. But they have their limitations. As I got to be interested in perspective, I got to very much want to do work like this, curvilinear perspective by M.C. Escher. And there were no grids for that. This is also a curvilinear perspective by Winsor McKay from Little Nemo. Escher had done his own preliminary drawings, which I liked the look of. And I just decided eventually to create my own. And I did this by working it out, working out the geometry of how curvilinear perspective would work, doing one little section and then just photocopying it to make the bigger diagram. So with that, I was able to revisit that one illustration of the woman in the tall desk and the man in the chair, and I think do a better version of it. I also used that same curvilinear grid to do this illustration for a trade publication. And this one was, I think this one might have been for geriatric nursing. I did a lot of work for very obscure trade magazines when I was starting out. This is another grid I designed, which is a fisheye perspective view. So, kind of like a fisheye photograph, but, like the curvilinear perspective, but curving in two different directions. And I was able to do illustrations like this, building off of that perspective grid. In 1997, I had already moved back to Portland by this point. I did my first perspective book, Perspective, exclamation point for comic book artists. I think the exclamation point is a good thing because you don't have to change it when this is made into a musical. And there was a section at the back where I included some hand-drawn perspective grids. Just a few of them because they're very time-consuming to draw. A year or two after that book came out, I got a computer. And that was a kind of a momentous step for me. And one of the first things I did was I got a CG program and created my own perspective grids that were basically, like Escher's drawing with the infinite field of columns, but divided up into little perspective squares. And by the way, those circles define the cone of vision, which is a perspective concept which you could read about if you read my book. And those of you who don't have my book already. And using those perspective grids, I was able to do illustrations like this. I did a lot of illustrations around this time where you had regularly spaced columns. Here's another one. And this whole series of perspective grids that I did came in very handy when I did my first 24-hour comic. I don't know if people know about 24-hour comics, but it's kind of self-explanatory. You sit for an entire day and you draw a page an hour, and you get an entire 24-page comic at the end of it. And this is something I'd heard about for years. I'd been curious. I wanted to try it, but I wanted a little bit of a boost. Rather than facing a terrifying blank page, I decided to work over some printouts of these computer grids, so that I would already have the beginnings of the scene. And I also figured that having the same perspective for an entire page would tie everything together, you know, as a design. So I'm going to take you through this quickly. Look at that man up on that building. The poor man, he's crazy. Jump. He's reached the 5th floor, sir. Damn, if he reaches the top, I'm out $1 million. Release the pigeons. This, by the way, is 2004, when Trump was just a guy on TV, not anything political. You know you'll never bring him down that way, Krupp. So here comes this pigeon. And you can see that he's got a mass of buildings in behind him that I would never have been able to draw freehand. And fortunately, our hero has popcorn in his pocket. So splat, splat. And our villain says, release the mouse. The mouse, not the mouse, the mouse. Okay. Wait. This one. Okay, so there goes the mouse. So our hero is whistling for the cat. And here comes the cat. And once again, regularly spaced columns. And for some reason, a flamingo attacks him, but winds up with his neck in a knot. And here comes the cat on the subway, climbing out of the subway, climbing the building. He'll never make it. Just shut up and smile for the people, Bunko. By the way, these odd elements. The other thing I did with this 24-hour comic was I had a sack of random reference, and I pulled one image from the sack every hour. So I had to incorporate this cigarette ad with this mannequin, or with its ventriloquist dummy. So anyway, and the mouse runs on the camel. Cat and mouse landing on camel in middle of city street is too absurd, comrade. I disagree. Is comment on hopeless situation in Iraq. I wanting telescope back, Commander. Scarlett Johansson is sunbathing. Actually, I don't think I used the perspective grid at all on this page, but we got to bring out the heavy guns. Release the itching powder. So there's the itching powder in a balloon. Poof. And this poor man, he's just itching. Harold's in trouble. So she runs down the hall. She says, quick, take off all your clothes. He takes off all his clothes. I think that goat head on the wall was probably my random piece of reference. And there. Once again, a nice building that I would not have been able to draw freehand. This guy must be stopped. Boss, psst, your mask is slipping. Why, Helen, without my glasses, you are beautiful. And now, go get him. So this Snake Plissken guy is ringing for the elevator. There's my random piece of reference, which is people playing football in the hall. So the elevator, there's someone in the elevator, says, sorry, full. So he goes to the stairs, but it's locked. So he shoots the door, but winds up being chased by a fusillade of bullets. So meanwhile, Harold is nearly there. And the kid says, Mommy, that man isn't wearing any. Hurry, we got to get these dress suits to the storeroom before the wind blows them away. When are they going to finish this building anyway? Darn. So suit gets blown away and into this impressive cityscape. including Portland's train station. And, oh, how nice. The suit lands on Harold. Meanwhile, in a totally unrelated spot, it looks like a bar, someone says, hey, look at the clock on that building. We get another half hour of happy hour. And everybody's dancing. And my regularly spaced columns come in handy yet again. Made it. Okay, so he's already at the top. Yay, except this weird propeller thing hits him in the head and he's falling backwards. But he's okay. He's okay, folks. So, never let it be said that Darnell Krupp Welshes on a bet. Here's your mill, hump. So he's seen with the giant check. But you gotta tell me, how'd you manage to get up that building despite everything I threw at you? It's simple. I'm a human fly. And we end with another cityscape in perspective. And God, it would have been like 9 in the morning then, but I was still going strong. So this is another perspective grid that I did on the computer. And I used, I think I designed a curved mirror and that reflected the scene around it. I think that's how I created that. And here's another version where it's instead of columns, it's a kind of a room that with regularly spaced floor tiles. So working over a perspective grid like that, I'm able to do fisheye views like this. And here's, once again, using the computer generated grids. This is a cylinder, a curvilinear perspective. Actually, this is one that you could map onto a sphere or use to create an immersive panorama. So it's the equivalent of, you might see those kind of immersive panoramas on Flickr. And this is another another curvilinear perspective view of an apartment. This is an oblique cylindrical perspective, which I'm quite proud of because it includes all 6 vanishing points. So in any rectilinear scene, there are 6. I mean, you think of 1, 2, and 3 point perspective, but there's actually a perspective grid at every point of the compass on the horizon, and also 1 above your head and 1 below your feet. So this gets all of them in, and it may be hard to read, but it actually generates a scene that kind of works. Like you don't even have to turn it upside down in order to read it. Now, eventually, all of these perspective grids wound up on an extra disc included with my second perspective book, Extreme Perspective. And I think, this came out in 2011. So I think this PowerPoint presentation was done mostly to try and sell the second book, and particularly to sell the included disc with all the grids on it. And back then I had an unrealized project, which is still unrealized, which is I wanted to do a book of perspective grids incorporating figure reference, human figures. There's a lot of books like this one that I took this image from, which show models from all different kinds of angles. But the thing about all of them is that they all have very blank backgrounds. So you can't really read how this figure would fit into a perspective scene. And if you do, you kind of have to guess at the perspective. Fortunately, this one includes one element, which is that turntable she's lying on, which can be presumed to be a circle, and I can draw a square around it and kind of estimate the kind of perspective scene she would be in. So having done that, I was able to put her into one of my perspective grids and use that as a basis for what I am going to show you next, which is this. This is a demo of me drawing over a printout of this perspective grid with a figure and creating an entire scene. This took about an hour, but I sped it up, so it'll only take about 5 minutes. And this is for a series that I've done called Random Haiku. And we're done now. Can I get back to Zoom? Maybe, oh, start video. Oh, there I am. Am I back? I can't see anybody else.
Yeah, you're still sharing the screen, so you should be good.
Okay, maybe, can I get, wow. Stop share. Oh, that'll do it. Sorry, I knew how to get in. I just wasn't sure how to get out. So does anyone have any questions?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I've got one thing. You were talking about Escher, and this is a coincidence. A colleague sent me a book that's probably from 1890 to 1910, Elementare Entwicklung des Ornaments, the elementary development of design.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of primitive the way this professor goes around developing the design, but then he gets back to repeated animals.
Oh,
But
yeah.
then the next thing we're getting is fish. You see the fish?
Mm-hmm.
This is pre-Escher, okay?
Oh.
And then there's the birds. Now, I'm not saying, now this is probably a pretty popular handbook, which would have been in Escher's time. And I'm not saying he ever had a copy, but he probably did. You know, your design people would have had a copy of this. Is a print house out of Leipzig.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying this is his copy, but it's going to San Diego State University. I just thought that was kind of cool.
So I've got a question about the blue lines that you were using. Are those like standard grids?
You mean the architectural grids?
Yes.
I don't know about standard. They're a thing that were available, and we're talking about, 35 years ago. They were a thing that you could buy at art stores. They're large format, and they're for, architectural rendering. So, architectural draftsmen would probably either work on a light table or on vellum over them, as a basis for architectural drawings.
Okay, and so for your 24-hour comic, you were using those
No,
grids.
I was using my own perspective grids. I was using the computer generated grids that I had been creating on my computer.
Okay.
And I was using, different angles. The way that I did it was I set up a field of columns and had my virtual camera in the middle and would just sort of rotate it, up, down, over this way in order to get, different varieties of 2 and 3 point perspective. You get 1 point perspective if you are, looking straight at a vanishing point. And the book is still in print, so if you think they would be useful, I would be tickled if you ordered one.
So I'm curious. You showed us the drawing, putting the woman in space on a rooftop, right? What sort of perspective challenges are you setting yourself right now? Because it is kind of a game, right? Of what point you are in space and how you're going to realize the objects in space, and it's never ending. That there's always something more to do. So what is your current challenge like you're setting yourself?
Well, I'm doing right now. I'm doing perspective instruction videos that I'm putting up every 2 weeks on my Patreon page. For a while, I was doing them in After Effects as animation, because it was, and I was also doing screenshots where I was working in Photoshop. But now I've got a really good setup, with a ring light and an iPad, a good camera on it. So I've been doing speed demos of me drawing, just like in that one.
Okay. Yeah. What kind of reception are you getting? What kind of comments and interaction are you getting over those?
I am getting the occasional like. I've also been posting them to YouTube after they've been on Patreon for about a year. And I've got, I don't know, something like 500 followers. And every once in a while I get, someone will post something like, "You're awesome." I also get, bot type saying, "I want to date you." But, that's what you get. That's what you got to expect on YouTube.
Yeah, well, I asked this because, perspective isn't particularly my jam. I started out in architecture. So, I remember David Ching and all those grids and stuff you could buy to do your rendering.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole generation, that went and bought David Ching at the bookstore. And actually, I'm a slight generation before that. But I have a friend who, we pretty regularly go and draw at coffee shops, and his jam is, fitting. Well, the best way I'd kind of say is, he's almost an, how he's drawing almost like an algorithm would work in 3D. So, that if he's drawing a, kind of an early cartoon figure, he'll have it situated in, a cube space. And I kind of follow along. I'm always just, I'm the audience there. So,
well, I mean, if you have that early grounding in architectural graphics, you kind of have a leg up. I mean, a lot of artists concentrate on the figure and work very hard at drawing the figure, and then the space that figure inhabits, the environment is an afterthought, or it's a background. But
oh, mine's not great, because I mean, my observed perspective, for whatever reason, I confuse left and right. So, I also confuse, this angle for this angle, and have to correct it. So, I don't have necessarily a really strong eye for that. But I'm constantly seeing, kind of what his challenge is that he's setting for himself. I'm doing something different myself. I played a different game to get through the pandemic. So, but fitting these things in space is always really interesting. So.
Oh, go ahead. Sin, is it your name?
It's fine, actually.
Fine. My apologies.
Yeah, no worries. So David, I am working through your books. I'm trying to learn perspective. I am a fairly new artist. And so I'm curious what you would recommend, like sticking with 1 point perspective and doing that to death before you go into 2 point, or is it okay to like jump around and just try whatever is fitting the comic that you're working on at the moment?
Well, for me, I pretty much stuck to 1 point. And if you see the early work that I was doing, I was making it as simple for myself as I could. And I really had to make the leap to taking perspective seriously only when I got a job that really called for 2 point perspective. I'm a great believer in taking on new challenges only when the pain of avoiding them is intolerable. So if you have a good understanding of one point perspective and it works for you, then you know, stick to it as long as you can. It's just you know, there are things that you can do in 2-point or 3-point perspective that are, you know, a little bit different than what you can achieve in 1-point perspective. But you know, I mean, for a lot of artists, 1-point perspective is all the challenge they need.
Well, I've dove into 3-point perspective because I'm doing a lot of like height stuff in buildings, kind of like what you were doing. I also have a second question about, there are programs now like Clip Studio Paint that are coming out with perspective rulers built into them. Have you played with those at all?
Very little. I know that Illustrator comes with perspective built in. My curiosity would be, I mean, since you've worked with them, do they provide regular division, or do they just give you the direction of lines?
They don't give you regular division, at least not that I've figured out in Clip Studio Paint. So
Yeah.
I've actually kind of started with the perspective rulers going, this is going to give it to me, and then realized I had to actually understand perspective before I could use the perspective rulers.
Yeah.
Which is why I started reading books and figuring things out that way.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the thing that really takes perspective, that really makes perspective rigorous, is regular division. And for that, you know, the most useful thing is establishing a diagonal vanishing point, which is pretty easy, except when it gets to 3-point perspective, you need to establish 3 of them. So that can get complicated. But yeah, to me, I don't like having to guess at convergence, you know, to guess at regular division. You know, it's so much more satisfying, you know, to have some kind of guide. You know, say you're drawing a fence that's going back in space, you know, rather than just guessing where those fence posts go. You know, just setting up a diagonal vanishing point so you can know with certainty where they would be.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, Rosanna.
Hi, I'm not an illustrator or cartoonist. I'm actually a visual facilitator, so I do quick drawings with my work. And I use Procreate on my iPad a lot. And in Procreate, it comes with the grids, the drawing grids, and you can select a 2D grid, isometric, perspective, and symmetry, right? And so the grids are already there.
Oh,
And
that's nice.
yeah, so it makes it easy for somebody who wants to cheat and do something real quick. But like Sign, I need to learn to understand how things actually look in order to do it well. I can, like I said, I use it mostly as a cheat sheet more than anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like, you know, the perspective grids that I'm working with, except, you know, I was working, you know, a decade ago when those kinds of built-in grids weren't available.
Yeah, and I love the complicated ones that you have with the sine curve and both the rectangular grid as well as the curvilinear ones combined. They're really interesting. Yeah. Thank you for showing us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hey, SK.
Hey there, sorry I don't have video. I'd like to ask you about a different kind of perspective, which is not visual. And that, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm, my background's in journalism, newspapers, magazines, now books. So I'm someone who hires people like you. And
wonderful.
So I'm interested to hear one, what your greatest frustrations are, or things that you feel that the people who hire illustrators don't understand. And then I'm also familiar with the heartbreak of printing issues where things sometimes don't come out as you expected. And so I'm also wondering if you have any stories of any work that you put your heart into that the finished product didn't turn out quite like you had expected.
Well, you know, more in the pre-computer era. I mean, actually, in the 90s, I was doing regular illustrations for the New York Press, and they switched over to digital scanning, I think, overnight. And suddenly everything was looking very jaggy. And I was extremely frustrated. And, you know, I complained to the art director, but it seemed like the art director wasn't even doing the scanning or had no control or didn't care. You know, it looked fine to him. So actually, a few years later, when everybody got personal scanners and when people weren't even mailing their art in, but sending it by email, I was thrilled because then I could control the DPI that I was scanning things at and getting them to look nice and smooth and not jaggy. Now, one implication of that is that all the people who had been doing that kind of production work that artists were now doing must have lost their jobs, and you know, rates weren't really increasing for all the extra work that that artists were doing. I mean, you know, I was such a control freak that I welcomed doing that, but it did, you know, add a few hours to every job that I did, you know, instead of just mailing it off and letting the reproduction be the client's problem. So it definitely cuts both ways. And now I do a lot of digital work, but I still do print work, and I've been doing a lot of work for a magazine that I think it's something to do with the way their work is printed, but everything comes out very dark and murky. So after a few commissions from them, I learned to just make everything kind of washed out and maybe a little oversaturated, so it would look decent in print. And that's one reason, actually, that the digital art is, you know, or art that's on computer or on websites is so nice, because essentially what you see on your monitor is what you'll see in the finished piece.
Thanks.
Cool. Anybody else? Anybody?
I don't have any questions, but I would definitely like to say I've really enjoyed this presentation.
Great. Sign. Oh, applause. Sorry. Yes, definitely.
So David, do you prefer to draw by hand or digital?
I prefer drawing by hand still. I know that there are people who are much more comfortable, but I'm still old-fashioned enough that I like the feel of, you know, pencil or pen on paper, which is why, you know, once I realized that I could shoot live video on my drawing board rather than in screenshots in Photoshop, I made the switch, and I haven't really gone back.
So sorry, so you're making video while filming you drawing with pen and paper?
This is the perspective instruction series I'm doing on Patreon. I'm putting up videos every 2 weeks, and some of them have been animation done in After Effects. Some of them have been speed demos drawn in Photoshop, but the last bunch of them have been like the video I showed you, which is just filming me drawing on paper.
Yeah, Roger.
Yes, Mr. Chelsea, regarding your library in the back of you,
Yes.
is that are the books designed by subject matter or by alphabet?
No, by color and size.
That's right there.
Which I kind of regret that, because sometimes it's hard to find books. I used to have them categorized by subject, but then I got, I don't know where it was a fad. I don't know who started it, but like the whole thing of, orange books go with orange books and green books go with green books. I fell for that, and now I can't disentangle them.
And another question from Sign.
Yeah, so I'm looking on Patreon and I'm not finding you. What is your Patreon name?
David Chelsea, DavidChelsea. I think they put me behind an adult paywall, or
Yeah.
and just to be extra nasty, I think my stuff is not searchable.
I had the same problem. I had to get my Patreon de-adultified. I had started doing nudes because I was showing my progress as an artist.
Yeah.
And it was quite the process to get de-adultified. But I'm searching under patreon.com, your name all run together, David Chelsea, and I'm not even finding you with the URL. Is there another way to locate it?
Gosh.
Is it off of your webpage?
Yeah, if you go to my webpage, there are lots and lots of posts about, comic series I put up, or the video series, and, with direct links. And that should bypass, whatever obstacles Patreon has put in front of you. So I guess if you can find one, maybe you can find my homepage. Come to think of it, it's very cumbersome, but they're prudes. So, and it's their sandbox, so they make the rules.
Right. So second question is, do you have any advice for someone who's new to perspective, like I am, to learning how to put the figure into perspective?
Yeah, I mean, you can figure out how much space the figure takes up. You can make a little box. Of course, figures are not necessarily standing straight up, but I mean, you could try drawing a coffin and then figure, how big is the figure that would fit in that coffin. I mean, everyone, is basically enclosed within, I'm going to say, from 5 to 6 feet, maybe tall, or maybe a little shorter. And maybe, a 2-foot square box. It gets a little more complicated, if your figure is moving around and, has its arms out or its legs out. But that's the best I could do. There's a chapter in my first book on the figure in perspective, but really, perspective is well suited to, furniture, cars, buildings, but less suited to organic shapes. You need to kind of bring in your intuition there. That's one reason that I wanted to do a book that would incorporate figures and perspective backgrounds together. I may still do it, but that's much more complicated than just the grids alone.
Yeah, well, when you made that comment about people drawing the figures and then the background as an afterthought,
Mhm.
I felt very called out. Like that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'm trying to do better now. So one thing I've done with the figure in perspective is to draw everything as boxes, like little box hands and box head and box rib cage.
Mhm.
Does that sound like a solid way to kind of at least get the proportions? Like if somebody's doing a dramatic pose, how to get?
Yes, although depending on the angle, you're going to have to draw a box that's, you know, in some variety of 3-point perspective.
Mhm.
And, you know, and you're going to have to draw several boxes all in their own, you know, singular form of perspective. So it gets to be very complicated if you're going to be rigorous about it. If you have a good intuitive feel for how to draw boxes in perspective without having to set up separate vanishing points for all of them, then that can be a good way of doing it. But I think it's almost simpler just to draw the figures from your head.
Mhm.
Oh, and sign, I had the same problem with the Patreon as well, but I got around it, and the link I just put on the chat.
Awesome, thank
Yeah.
you.
Mhm. Okay, anybody else?
Well, this isn't really a question, but I don't know if you guys can see this, but with the perspective, it made me think of this drawing I did long ago. You can't really see it, but essentially you've got clowns in a circus and they show up, but then you look way, way down and they're standing on the shoulders of these women who are standing on 3 horses. And it was fun to do, but I didn't have any science of how to do it.
Could I say that there's the old tradition of going and seeing what the masters have done and how they handle perspective. And if anybody here wants to really see how, and everybody who knows here why I'm mentioning horses, if you want to see perspective in horses, you go to Remington. He knows exactly how that works. And also, if you really, we have an access to something a lot of people didn't have to have, but that's YouTube and TikTok and everything else. You have all kinds of moving figures and models, and you can go and you can study how, let us say, a hoof or a foot or whatever up close is working. And as David is saying that, yeah, you can actually lay down perspective for all these little, you know, round parts and everything. But practice and intuition is an awful lot of it, and YouTube is just a good source of all these models.
Interesting that you mentioned Remington. I mean, one interesting thing about Remington is that he was a sculptor as well. And I mean, this is kind of off the topic of perspective, but I have found it very useful in drawing figures and in drawing characters looking consistent to model them in plasticine. Or also to construct them in CG. There's a great program called Sculptress that where that kind of approximates working in clay, and you can create. I've just been doing heads, but having those you know, heads and being able to turn them at any angle is a, you know, it's a great assist to drawing. And you know, and the perspective is automatically correct.
Well, they still have, when people are doing animation, it's not strictly digital. There's an awful lot of sculpting and making figures that they scan by, you know, the dot method. They scan in just like they would scan a figure, like Bill Nye and Pirates of the Caribbean. And so they're still doing that. They're still doing that. It's just easier to do the figure than it is to figure out, you know, the whole perspective.
Yeah, I've never worked in animation, but I think it's probably an excellent grounding for being a cartoonist, because animators, you know, they really have to think about working in 3 dimensions. So it's good for your figure drawing, and it's also good for perspective. If anybody wants to spend a few years in animation before they go into comics. Usually the trajectory is the other way around.
Sometimes I think it should be mandatory, because I know some in comics a lot of absolutely excellent draftsmen who don't know the first thing about their character's acting.
Yeah, there's some. It's a skill.
Well, anybody else?
David,
Yes.
my introduction to you was through David Chelsea in Love. I realize that the topic tonight is perspective, but things might be thinning out a little bit. So I was wondering if you could say anything about that.
Well, that was an excellent chance for me to use perspective, because I had to create realistic backgrounds for it, and also that was the first project I did where I modeled the figures in plasticine. Just very simple. I just did very simple heads, earless, eyeless, hairless, but there was something about getting the volume of the head right, and the shapes of noses, mouths, and chins, where I just was able to realize the characters. And I think I think say what you will about the book, I think the characters are recognizable from panel to panel, and that may seem like a low bar, but there are a lot of cartoonists who can't meet it. Like I have trouble reading a lot of comics done today where I really can't follow the story because I can't recognize the characters from panel to panel. They either look all the same or they don't look consistent. So I'm very lost.
It's the ones where the characters all look so similar. That's really hard. Yeah.
Don't want to name any names, but I remember reading some young adult book. I forget who it was. I think it was Faith Erin Hicks. And it was some YA thing about high school robotics, and I was reading it, and it was fun, it was entertaining, but I was just in awe that all these high school characters all were identifiable. They all looked like themselves from panel to panel, and I had just read a graphic novel by somebody else who couldn't do that, and I was like, oh my gosh, I am in the hands of a master.
Well,
I was actually talking about the story more than the perspective.
Oh, what about the story?
Yeah, no, but I just didn't want to get in the way of people asking questions about perspective, but whatever you're comfortable with.
Well, it's been a long time since I did that book, and even longer, that since the events in the book. But I will say one thing. Anger is an excellent engine. I was very angry for a very long time at my ex-girlfriend. And the book, I think, came out maybe like in 8 years after we broke up. And I think, not that I still feel that way now, but anything that can still make you angry 8 years after the fact, that's a gift to an artist. So if you have something that you're stewing about from 8 years ago, go for it.
Never piss off a cartoonist. Oh, I didn't make that one up.
Wasn't it Matt Groening?
Well, it goes back a long way. Remember Judge, or what was it, Tweed of the Teapot Dome scandal, or however that all went back there in the 1890s?
Not personally, but I've read about him.
Yeah, but it was they had all these famous cartoons. Thomas Nast was doing the
Thomas
cartoons.
Nast, yes.
And when they finally got a hold of the guy that he'd been making the cartoons about, the guy had several original cartoons that were really slamming him, because it turns out that if no matter how angry you may be at somebody, they prize the cartoons that you draw about them. They still want them.
Yeah, and when he made it, and when he was on the run from fraud, for fraud due to the NAS cartoons, didn't somebody in Spain recognize him because of the cartoon?
Because of the NAS cartoons. But he loved it. Oh, that's another thing. If you have a reviewer or an editor that doesn't like you, if you put them in the book, they become a super fan almost immediately. I'm not saying I ever did this.
Oh man. So anybody else? Oh, great.
Actually, what John was saying about perspective, you're talking about the story. Well, of course, stories are from the perspective of the characters. So, you know, you're in the wheelhouse there.
I don't know why. I think maybe I was reading in segments or something. I never actually read the end. So I didn't know that there was bad feelings about it. So I apologize for bringing that up.
Oh, no. We're all friends now.
Okay, good.
There were a few years where, you know, there were some hurt feelings.
Gotcha.
Well, thank you so much. Having been in Portland in the 1980s, I may just have to go read that just because it's Portland in the 1980s.
Oh yeah, well, I was drawing Portland in the 1980s from the perspective of Portland in the 1990s. There weren't that many changes. Now I would have to I would have to do extensive research, but then I could just you know, take pictures of places that were still around, that were still much the same.
Okay.
So yeah, you'll see Quality Pie and the Virginia Cafe are in it.
Well, I've been to all those places, but yeah, you're right. During the 80s, not much got built anywhere, right? And you know, I was only able to get back into the architecture biz into 87 because there weren't any jobs between, you know, 80 and 87 essentially. So yeah, I guess if I want to look at Portland, I can go back to that.
Yeah, it's out of print, but I'm sure it's all over Amazon and eBay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, somebody will have it. Anyway, but thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great. Well, if that's everybody, I want to thank David for a wonderful talk. And also, our next event is our online drink and draw, which is 6:30 next Thursday, the 22nd at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. And also, if you want to, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to get copies of our newsletter, the pen stuff, Maureen just posted her email address for you to request to be put on that list. And once again, the Best of the Northwest thread has been posted up. If you can't miss it, it has the picture of the totem pole mascot saying Best of the Northwest July. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming. And again, thank you. Oh dear, somebody came in just at the end. Thank you again for coming, and hope everybody got a lot out of it, and thank you again, David.